What's up, everyone? Welcome to the show. It's Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM, the sportsbook born in Vegas. It is waiver wire day. It is trade deadline day. It's college football playoff ranking day. It's a big day for football fans, and we're going to tell you who to add, who to drop, who to buy, who to sell, and all those things. And I'm going to ask you a question that you don't know is coming, Dave and Jamie, although I've already had this discussion with Jamie, so I'll let you start while Dave thinks about it. Christian McCaffrey could be coming back this week. Who is the number one player in fantasy? If you were drafting today and you had the first pick, who would you take in fantasy?
Saquon Barkley.
You didn't give Dave much time to think. Dave, now you're on the clock.
Gabe Davis. No, it's Saquon Barkley. Derrick Henry would be number 2. Christian McCaffrey would be a first rounder, but probably toward the end of the first round.
Okay, I'll take Henry over Barkley, but fine. All right, so we'll go through some of our big topics. Let's go ahead and start with Monday Night Football overtime win for the Kansas City Chiefs over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Dave, Richard, what were your big takeaways from Tampa Bay, Kansas City?
Well, how about DeAndre Hopkins? Let's just start with him. His second game with Kansas City, he looked outstanding, had a big game, the touchdowns, everything was awesome for him. And for this Kansas City passing game, Patrick Mahomes had a big game. And granted, it's Tampa Bay, and so we got to pump the brakes a little bit, and there's going to be tougher matchups ahead, including this coming week against Denver. But to me, DeAndre Hopkins is right back on the map as, at minimum, a number 3 fantasy wide receiver. Maybe not this week, but rest of season, sure. And if he just continues to connect with Mahomes like he did on Monday, he'll push to be a number 2 fantasy wide receiver.
You two guys, we sat here Sunday night on our show, and you said tight ends stink. And what did I tell you? We still got 3 guys to go. Well, 1 wasn't good in TJ Hawkinson, but 2 were awesome in Travis Kelce and Cade Otton. And Otton has just been an absolute stud since Chris Godwin and Mike Evans have gone down. And look, we know Evans is coming back after their bye in week 12, but Cade Otton, I think, is going to be a mainstay in this offense and a mainstay for fantasy managers. He's just been such a go-to guy for Baker Mayfield, and I don't think it's going to slow down. So you see 11 targets, 8 catches, 77 yards, and a touchdown. This is now 31 targets in his last 3 games, including the game where those guys got injured. So he's just been a focal point. And look, Travis Kelce has helped Patrick Mahomes the last 2 weeks, get back to scoring back-to-back games with over 20 fantasy points. And Kelce is going to be a mainstay. Hopkins, we'll see what happens with him moving forward. Tough matchup for him against the Broncos in week 10. And Juju Smith-Schuster may return. We may get a couple weeks back and a couple weeks into the season, and Marquise Brown is back. But Kelce looks like they flipped the switch, and he's going to be this type of player for the rest of the season.
And with Otton, I know, speaking of returns, Mike Evans will be back soon. That doesn't really worry me. I still think Cade Otton's still going to get a lot of targets. Won't be this good, but still top 10 fantasy tight end good. Absolutely.
Top 5, though?
He'll have some weeks.
I mean, think about the position, and he's the, we say, okay, maybe Jalen McMillan was going to be the Chris Godwin replacement, maybe Sterling Shepard. It's Cade Otton.
Yeah. Well, okay. So borderline top 5, we'll say that. I don't really know what you meant by think about the position.
The position, it's too up and down, so we don't get consistent performances. You get a guy that's getting 10 plus targets, he's going to be a must start.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Topic number 2. We usually don't have coaching changes to talk about, but we do. We've got an offensive coordinator change in Las Vegas, a head coaching change in New Orleans. Jamie, is there any fantasy impact here?
I mean, look, for the Raiders, if they had multiple options to lean on, you'd say, okay, yes, maybe this changes for this player or that player. Brock Bowers, I don't care. You could be calling plays. He's a must-start tight end. And Jacoby Myers, based on what we've seen for the last 2 games, he's a must-start wide receiver, or certainly in the 3 receiver range, so top 30 wide receiver at worst case scenario rest of season. The quarterback will be, probably determine how we feel about these guys. So if it's going to be Desmond Ridder or Gardner Minshew, we'll see what decision that happens. And the running backs really it's a coin flip. If it's Alexander Madison, maybe he's a flex. If Zamir White gets more of an opportunity, could be somebody to add off the waiver wire. So really there's not a lot to change for what's happened for the Raiders.
Hopefully Jacoby Myers stays with the Raiders, because his value could really fluctuate if he goes to another team and he works as like a number 2 receiver with another team. I love the volume that he's getting. In New Orleans, we know that there's no more Dennis Allen. He was a defensive play caller. Clint Kubiak is still going to be calling the plays there on offense. So I don't really see much difference there. I think they'll rally around Alvin Kamara. Why wouldn't they? He's been awesome this year. And you'll see more of Taysom Hill until they get their receiving core back healthy. That'll include Chris Olave. I would hope that Olave would come back at some point this season. And when he does, he could be in line for 8+ targets week in and week out. But fantasy managers are going to be skeptical about trusting him long term, because he could suffer another injury and be out for a while. But the passing game otherwise for New Orleans, really nothing to get excited about there.
And by the way, Jamie, since you said if I were calling the plays for Raiders, let me tell you what I would do. I would keep it very simple. I would have my 4 run plays and my 4 pass plays that I absolutely mastered on Tecmo Super Bowl back in 1992. This would be from the Giants playbook. They had a reverse flea flicker. It was very successful, and we would run it over and over again, and I'm sure we would have just as much success as I did.
Hey, Wildcat worked for Tony Sperano once upon a time. You could probably get some production out of that offense as well.
There we go. Double flea flicker, or whatever it was. Reverse flea flicker. Okay, let's talk buy low, sell high. Dave, you're up. Your favorite buy low is Breece Hall.
I think that we shouldn't write the eulogy for him just yet. I know that his fantasy production hasn't been good, and we know that Aaron Rodgers is someone that we'll talk about later as being a decent fantasy starter rest of season. But he's a really good running back, and I think fantasy managers who are soured on him and they give him away at this point, they're doing it at too low of a cost. I like the schedule rest of the way for the Jets as well. He's somebody that I'm absolutely going to make some offers on.
I think if you're looking at it, you're saying to the Breece Hall manager, man, look what happened 2 games ago. Braylon Allen had 12 carries.
Yeah.
He's got a couple touchdowns along the way. They're not giving him those goal line opportunities. He's not catching the ball as much. I agree with you. You get you get Breece Hall cheap. The schedule's so favorable to close the season. He's going to be a league winner still.
And you have CeeDee Lamb as your buy low. So how do you value him going forward with Dak Prescott likely going on IR, with Lamb dealing with a shoulder injury? What are you trying to give up to get CeeDee Lamb?
I'm probably trying to give up almost next to nothing for somebody who is desperate. We had this conversation on our podcast, right? You said you're a CeeDee Lamb manager. You need to win this week. You just lost Dak Prescott. You had both those guys in the same league. Think about the guys that we discussed, and you considered the trade. Not that you would make it, but you considered it. I said to you, would you take Josh Downs and Chuba Hubbard? You say I like a running back a little bit safer than Chuba Hubbard. But that's the range of players that we're talking about here that might be able to acquire CeeDee Lamb. Downs is somebody you picked up off the waiver wire, either beginning of the season or after he was dropped with the quarterback situation in Indianapolis. So you're talking about some borderline number 2, number 3 receivers, some borderline, top 20 caliber running back that might be able to get it done, and so it's going to be a specific situation. Desperate CeeDee Lamb fantasy manager looking to get a win now, nervous about the shoulder injury. He may miss this week, but if my team is 1 loss, 2 losses, maybe undefeated, certainly looking like a strong playoff contender, if I can get CeeDee Lamb cheap, I'm absolutely trying to make those offers because it might get done.
We got a tweet in response to our CeeDee Lamb discussion on the show this morning. Should I trade CeeDee Lamb for David Montgomery? And I don't even know why I had to think about it, because that is an automatic yes for me. I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but I would absolutely take Montgomery for Lamb.
He's higher on the trade chart, and I think that he's somebody who can still deliver certainly more touchdowns than CeeDee Lamb over the course of the season. It's when you get into those full PPR leagues, will there be games where CeeDee Lamb has double-digit targets and puts up a big number without Dak Prescott on the field? And if you think there will be, then maybe you don't make that trade. But overall, I think that is a better trade. I'd rather have Montgomery.
It's hard to say, without knowing the rosters, because, you need a running back. That's a great trade. You need the receivers. You're going to keep CeeDee Lamb. But yes, I think just in a vacuum, which player has a higher ceiling moving forward? It's probably David Montgomery right now. But it's not like Dak Prescott has been playing that great, and that's, I think, a byproduct of CeeDee Lamb's numbers. CeeDee Lamb hasn't been playing that great, which is a byproduct, I think, of the entire offense. And so it should be easy to get him at such a discounted price that it's worth the investment, because after those 4 games, if Dak does come back and looks like Dak Prescott again, it's a huge if, but that could be just a monstrous finish and playoff run for CeeDee Lamb.
Last thing on this is really a very important topic, but in 5 games with Cooper Rush in 2022, CeeDee Lamb was pretty good. He was on pace for 105 catches, 1,292 yards, 7 touchdowns. He averaged just under 10 targets per game.
You'd call that a low-end number 1, high-end number 2 fantasy receiver in PPR, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
That's where he is on the trade chart.
That was still the ascension for CeeDee Lamb, not the breakout CeeDee Lamb, because he really didn't break out until second half of last season. So he's a better player now.
Yes. Okay. And then finally, not finally, so we have to talk waiver wire as well. But our next topic number 4, is your favorite sell high, and it's the Kansas City Chiefs. It's Dave saying Patrick Mahomes, Jamie saying DeAndre Hopkins. Dave, you can start here. I mean, do you agree about Hopkins too? Jamie, do you agree about Mahomes, and why?
Yeah, it's just why, because we just saw a game where DeAndre Hopkins turned back the clock and had 2 touchdowns, almost 100 yards, 8 catches. He was unstoppable. It came against Tampa Bay. This is a team in Kansas City that's still going to use DeAndre Hopkins. He's going to get a lot of targets week in and week out, but the matchups are going to get harder for him. I just want to tell you who they're playing in the fantasy playoffs. This is week 15 through 17. They're at Cleveland, home against Houston, and then at Pittsburgh. And say what you will about Houston's defense right now and Cleveland's defense too, but I think that those are still going to be difficult challenges. Isaiah Pacheco might be back at that point, and we've really seen Kansas City, not exactly outside of last night's game, kind of lean on their run game a little bit more. And I don't know if I can buy into Patrick Mahomes being back to a top 3, top 5 type of fantasy quarterback. And someone in every league just lost Dak Prescott. So you should be able to get something real good in exchange for Patrick Mahomes. And a lot of people who have Mahomes have another quarterback because they haven't been starting Mahomes lately.
Old receiver coming off a great matchup and taking advantage of it. I just don't see that happening for DeAndre Hopkins very often. Juju may return. That's just going to be another mouth to feed at some point. Maybe Marquise Brown does return. Like they've said, Isaiah Pacheco on a run-first team. So if I can get... if you tell me I could turn DeAndre Hopkins into CeeDee Lamb, I'm doing that in a heartbeat.
You'd have to throw something in with that, but you could.
Without question.
Legitimately could.
Yep.
That was going to be my question because the other thing with Lamb is the shoulder, right? It's not just the Dak thing.
You are potentially buying damaged goods. You have to understand what you're getting. So that's why I don't think you want to be trying to trade Tyreek Hill in a buy low situation for that manager into CeeDee Lamb. I'd much rather have Tyreek Hill rest of season. But I think if you could turn someone coming off of some of these unprecedented games or waiver wire options, like if you could turn Cedric Tillman and a running back into CeeDee Lamb, all day long, DeAndre Hopkins and a running back into CeeDee Lamb, without question. It's just not sustainable for these guys for what CeeDee Lamb might still be. You just illustrated what his numbers were with Cooper Rush. Yeah. Love that. And I'll take my chances if he misses 1 week, maybe 2 weeks. Hopefully he's going to still play the rest of the season, but you just got to just don't put yourself in a situation where you're giving up a superstar for Lamb right now.
I think if you can trade for Lamb, you say, if the guys I'm giving up don't really matter to me,
right,
I'm still going to be okay, then you do it in a heartbeat. We got to wrap this segment up. So it is Waiver Wire Tuesday here, as opposed to Waiver Wire a different day of the week. No. Give me your top 3 Waiver Wire priorities, Jamie, and then Dave, you can just say ditto.
It's a very good week for wide receiver and tight end, especially at the tight end position. So when you look at Mike Gesicki and what the options are for him for Thursday, if he's able to still be the guy without T. Higgins, 6 targets, 5 catches, 100 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 27 PPR points. 4 games that he's played now without T. Higgins. 3 of them he's been north of 12 PPR points. It's easy to say must start player if Higgins doesn't play. Quentin Johnston and Xavier Legette are basically the Spider-Man meme. They're going to look at each other and say, okay, you need a touchdown? No, you need a touchdown. You're going to get 5 targets. You're going to get 6 targets. You're going to get 4 catches. Maybe one of us breaks a long play. They're both potential top 30 wide receivers rest of season.
I'll give you 3 more names because I agree with this order. I think Hunter Henry could be a great fantasy tight end rest of season. I would take him over Gesicki rest of season. For this week, it would obviously be Gesicki.
Just rewind the tape from last week.
Yeah, right. Taysom Hill is another tight end who I think is going to get some good opportunities. And I think Rome Odunze is a candidate to be a breakout in Chicago down the stretch. That's a guy who could really get going for Chicago, a downfield threat. And we know that Caleb Williams needs help right now. He really needs help on the offensive line. But once they figure that out in Chicago, if they figure that out in Chicago, Odunze could take that next step. I'd like to have him on my bench.
Can we also just cheat and go above the threshold we normally talk about? So I don't know. I'll take Derrick Henry if he's available.
Yeah. I would say also if you need a flex this week, don't overlook Mike Gesicki as a flex. If you already have a tight end that you like,
start him as a tight end this week because it's the early game. You want to put somebody else in the flex spot later.
Absolutely
it's just roster setting semantics.
But you're right, Adam.
Stuff.
If you're the Trey McBride manager or the Travis Kelce manager, and you can get Gesicki to fill another starting spot for you, and T. Higgins doesn't play, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a break, and when we come back, we've got quarterbacks and running backs on waivers. And I can tell you, in one of my leagues, there are like 4 quarterbacks that I want, so I got to figure it out. Is it going to be Aaron Rodgers? Is it going to be Trevor Lawrence? Is it going to be Justin Herbert? These guys are available in a lot of leagues. We'll help you sort it out after this on Fantasy Football Today. The quarterback with the best schedule going forward is, of course, thankfully for all fantasy managers, of course, it's Daniel Jones. And it starts this week with the Carolina Panthers, who are 29th against opposing quarterbacks, and he is 23% rostered. So this is actually someone that a lot of people can get. Now, some of you out there are going to be able to choose between Aaron Rodgers and Justin Herbert and guys like that. But let's go ahead and take a look at the waiver wire list provided by Jamie Eisenberg. Make sure you look at his column on CBSSports.com. So here are the guys that are rostered in fewer than 65% of leagues. Justin Herbert's just ahead of that. And then there are other guys like Tua and Matthew Stafford. But you've got Rodgers, and then you got Lawrence, who has two really good matchups coming up, and he's actually been putting up some decent fantasy production. But what are your thoughts on these guys? Are they must-adds? Are they just one-week replacements? Go ahead, Jamie.
Well, it depends on your situation. You just lost Dak Prescott. We've certainly had some up and down quarterback play. We are getting at least one must-start quarterback, in my opinion, back with Brock Purdy and a maybe starter in Russell Wilson, who you see on this list, with those two guys coming back from their bye week. But you head into Week 10 with some pretty good quarterbacks on a bye. Jordan Love, not going to be available to you. Geno Smith, who's, coming off a good stretch of games, not going to be available to you. So I think if you're looking short-term versus long-term, it depends on what your roster looks like. So Daniel Jones, you can make a case, should be the best quarterback for this week. Aaron Rodgers is coming off his best game of the season with Devontae Adams finally producing. You mentioned Trevor Lawrence. It's been 19.5 PPR, 19.5 fantasy points or more in 3 of his last 4 games. Drake May has been one of the better running quarterbacks that we've seen certainly the last 2 weeks, 46 yards rushing and a touchdown and a half against the Jets. And then he comes back last week against the Titans with 95 yards rushing. So there's a case to be made, I think, for a lot of the guys at the top. Russell Wilson on down, it's really more, I think, of deeper leagues or looking ahead long term. But in the case of Rodgers, Lawrence, May, and Jones, you can make a case for starters for this week and maybe even starters rest of season.
I like Jones the best as far as Week 10 goes. And I'm trying to think like a Dak Prescott fantasy manager, because I'm not going to have Dak for at least, 4 or 5 weeks. So whenever he comes back, if he comes back, I need somebody to replace him. I love that schedule for Daniel Jones, but I know I can't use him in Week 11 because he's on bye. So Aaron Rodgers as a long-term option makes a lot of sense to me. I think he's a high-floor fantasy quarterback. I think he can roll out of bed and get 200 yards and 2 touchdowns every single week. The third touchdown is what I would worry about. But when he does get it, boom, you're talking about a top 8, top 6 type of fantasy quarterback. So if I'm looking for that floor, I think Rodgers has it more than any other quarterback on that list.
I just, and I'm with you on Daniel Jones. He should do well. But we've seen this now with the Panthers where we've said, okay, start the guy against the Panthers. Well, Derek Carr just did not have a good fantasy day, 17 fantasy points in that range. You can see Daniel Jones doing something like that. Kirk Cousins coming off the huge game that he had at Tampa Bay, face the Panthers next week, 14.5 fantasy points. So Daniel Jones certainly can have one of those stinkers. So just keep that in mind. And if he struggles, we've talked about this, Adam, he may not be starting the rest of the way, and they may decide, you know what? We want to win this game. We need to win this game. We're benching Daniel Jones in the middle of that game in Germany. So I don't think it's a slam dunk that you're starting him this week.
Yeah, Dave, are you saying that you would start Jones over Aaron Rodgers this week?
I would start Jones over Rodgers this week because, listen, this is the worst defense in the NFL right now in the Carolina Panthers. And not only has Jones thrown it moderately well this season, there have been moments, don't get me wrong, especially since Andrew Thomas went down, where he's looked pretty bad. But he's also running the ball really well. And I think he's kind of – I was okay with how he played against Washington. And this is an easier matchup for him. So between his rushing and the fact that he could hit on a couple of downfield plays, I think Neighbors has a big week. I think Jones is a low-end starter.
And just before we move on to running backs, let's throw Herbert, Stafford, and Tua into the equation.
Right.
And then what does it look like then, Dave?
Stafford would be at the top of the list for me. And then I'd put Herbert next. And then I kind of like Jones more than Tua this week, to be honest with you.
Okay. And I think look, you have to obviously look at your waiver wire and figure out who's there on most weeks. I can't just generalize, but there are so many quarterbacks that fit into just a big group of, well, they're pretty much the same, but depending on the matchup, we're going to rank them a certain way. And so you can play the waiver wire, right, with that spot.
Absolutely.
Maybe Geno Smith goes on waivers and you pick him up one week, and you know what I'm saying? You just cycle through that spot at quarterback. But you have to know your league. All right, with that said, let's take a look at running back here. And it's not great. It's not great, but
it's
shield your eyes. But Isaac Guerrero is someone Jamie's interested in because both of the guys in front of him are dealing with injuries, and you never know with Christian McCaffrey and these Achilles flare-ups. You've got Jalen Warren. You've got not just Jaleel McLaughlin, but Audric Estime maybe. Are you excited to pick up any of these guys, Jamie?
Yes and no. I think if your fantasy team is certainly looking like a playoff contender and you feel comfortable with your roster, and there's some guys that are at the end of your bench that are never going to help you, you don't want to give anybody players that are going to help them, but you can try and handcuff your running back or steal somebody else's handcuff. And that's, I think, what a lot of this list is about. Guerrero is in a little bit of a different spot, let's say, than Blake Corum or Kamani Vidal or Trey Benson, because you can see an instant path to him playing in Week 10. If McCaffrey's not ready to go, which John Lynch has sort of hedged a little bit, and Jordan Mason's not ready to go from the shoulder injury, Guerrero would be a top 20 running back even with a tough matchup against Tampa Bay. You saw, Kareem Hunt, for example, just score a touchdown against them. Guerrero can do that. There's also the scenario where Guerrero becomes an absolute waste on your roster because if both Mason and McCaffrey are ready to go, then he's probably third on the depth chart at best, and you may never play him. So I wouldn't spend too much fab on him, but I wouldn't spend too much fab on any of these guys. Tyjae Spears, Jalen Warren, Justice Hill, throw Jaleel McLaughlin in there. They're all kind of in a similar situation where they're potential flex options when they're playing. They're also lottery tickets in case the guy in front of them gets hurt. You mentioned Audrey Estime. Sean Payton said on Monday that we're going to give him some more work, so he's another guy that could factor in down the stretch. But really, when you look at all these guys, you're waiting to see if they could become lottery tickets. Blake Corum's playing behind a guy in Kyron Williams that's been playing the last 4 games, 86% of the snaps. Vidal's playing behind J.K. Dobbins, who is 8 or 9 carries away from setting a career high in carries for the season. The last time he had 130 some odd carries was in 15 games as a rookie in 2020. He's at 126 carries in 8 games right now. We know that injury track record there. Trey Benson's behind James Conner, who's missed 3+ games in 5 of the last 6 seasons. We know the injury track record there. So there's scenarios here where all of these guys, or a handful of these guys, could be fantasy lottery tickets, winners for you. But they also may be just taking up space at the end of your bench. It just depends on what your team looks like.
And just to stump for Guerrero for a second, you could add him now. He shouldn't cost you much in fab. And you just wait and see what happens with the 49ers running backs in practice this week, because you should be able to find one of Spears, Warren, Hill, McLaughlin. That's how I'd rank those 4 guys. And if you needed a running back, if you were just desperate for a bye-week running back, you could pivot to one of those guys and drop Guerrero if it's clear that McCaffrey's back or Jordan Mason's going to play, or worst-case scenario, both of them are going to play, and Guerrero ends up inactive for the game.
Well, we've got a lot of wide receivers and tight ends to talk about. And a trade. We'll tell you who the newest Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver is about this teaser after this break on Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. Welcome back, everybody, to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. Adam, Dave, and Jamie here. We're talking wide receivers and tight ends that are on your waiver wire. We like Quentin Johnston. We like Xavier Legette. I'm going to ask you some quick questions. Would you drop Jamison Williams for one of your favorite waiver wire wide receivers?
Yes.
Depends what my team looks like.
I'm in on either one of Johnson or Legette for Jamison Williams.
Okay. Jamie, your team looks like it's got 1 quarterback. It's got 2 running backs. It's 6 bench spots.
Like that's attractive. Yeah.
Blue and white because you're on CBS, obviously.
Nice.
Would you?
So I'll tell you, you got Johnson and Legette both going into their bye weeks. So you got to keep that. I'm sorry, you have Legette going to his bye week. Johnson is already past his bye week, but he's got a little bit of an injury concern. So can he stay healthy? All 3 of these receivers so far, at least, have not shown the ability to command consistent targets at a high end level. You got to be a little concerned about Williams' targets recently, but the offense is definitely better for the Lions. And if they ever decide to open things up and be more pass happy, which could happen if they make a MVP push for Jared Goff, then Jamison Williams will be better than those guys.
Would you drop Keenan Allen or Roma Dunze or both for Legette and Johnston?
I want to have a Dunze on my fantasy roster. Keenan Allen's the easy one to drop. Would I drop both of those Bears for both of those receivers? I probably would if I needed wide receiver depth. Like, I've been churning wide receivers. I need some starters, some guys that give me some potential right now. I would do that. And even though Legette is on bye soon, that would be a problem. But right now, this week, they're both playing.
Yeah, I think I'd rather hold Odunze, again, if I'm not starting any of these guys. Allen, though, has got 17 targets in his last 2 games. At some point, they're going to start to connect. But Williams got this ankle injury, though, so it could be easy to just move on from the 2 Bears guys.
Okay, and do you want to hold the Browns wide receivers through their bye week?
I've already dropped Elijah Moore, so no. But Cedric Tillman, I think he's going to continue to get consistent targets, so I would like to hold on to him.
Cedric Tillman is an easy hold. There's no way you're dropping. He'd be the first player to add, maybe at any position. For Judy, it's 2 games with Jameis Winston, 3 games without Amari Cooper. In those 2 games, it's 12.9 PPR points or more in both of those outings. And with how much the Browns are going to throw the ball, yes, I would take Judy and Tillman over everybody on the field.
And one wide receiver here that's not on the list because he's too rostered, but he's in the same range as Tillman, is Juwan Jennings, with Deebo Samuel still day-to-day. So definitely someone that you want to be adding right now. He's about 75% rostered, Juwan Jennings. Okay, so now let's take a look at the players who are rostered in less than 65% of leagues, and the ones you want to get. And Jamie said Lee gets going into his bye. That's next. He meant next week. This week he gets the Giants. Then he gets week. Yeah. So he does have a bye, though, still on the schedule. But how big of a difference is there for you between Johnston and Legette and then everyone else, number 3? Because I know we were kind of you could go either way with those top 2 guys, but what about everyone behind them? Is there a big gap, Dave, between the top 2 and everyone else?
I think there is. There's just nothing to get super excited about. You can buy into Johnston and his role with the Chargers. You can buy into Legette and his role with the Panthers. Douglas has a pretty good role with the Patriots, too, especially when it's Drake May under center. But everybody else on this list, there's something that leaves you to be desired, and it doesn't have the same type of upside as those first 3. And that includes Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, who scored in 4 straight games. But he really isn't a high-volume wide receiver, and they might be going back to Will Levis at quarterback, and that could just make him a total mess.
There's a few different situations at play here because, you got Parker Washington, who's going to be the slot receiver for the Jaguars rest of season. You talked about this, Adam. The matchups coming up are very favorable against Minnesota in Week 10, Detroit in Week 11. Hopefully Washington continues to run as many routes as he did in the Week 9 game against the Eagles. Much tougher matchup. Didn't see as many targets as you would like, but I think there's a lot of production coming for him in the next several weeks. Week 11, Elijah Moore could be a number 3 receiver, just given his role in the matchup against New Orleans. Jalen McMillan did not play in Week 9. Hopefully his hamstring is going to be okay, and he can get back out there and maybe have a couple weeks of production before Mike Evans returns. And then you got Jalen Tolbert, could be the number 1 receiver for the Cowboys if, in fact, CeeDee Lamb's shoulder injury is a problem. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then Ray McLeod, if Drake London doesn't return from his hip injury and misses Week 10, you'd be interested in him against a Saints defense that just lost Marshawn Lattimore. And there's one name that's not on this list, which is now Mike Williams, who was traded from the Jets to the Steelers and now could be in a prominent role where he hasn't been with the Jets because of better players on the field, certainly the last 3 weeks with Devontae Adams joining the team. We could see Mike Williams getting a few of those jump balls from Russell Wilson, and he could have some good production moving forward.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting week. I mean, it's mostly number 3 receivers, right? I don't know if any of those guys are cracking your top 24 this week, are they?
No.
Not this week, but you can kind of see it down the line with both Johnston and Legette if they see a target increase, because they're already in a role with both of their teams respectively where they're playing a lot. And so if they continue to do well on the minimal targets that they're getting, and they're not that minimal, but if they can expand that to 7, 8, 9 targets, then you can get kind of excited about those guys.
You also have for Legette the last 2 weeks of Bryce Young starting. If they go back to Andy Dalton without Deontay Johnson on the team, that could be huge for him.
And honestly, if they stick with Young, at least he's playing better than he did in the first 2 weeks of the season.
Also true.
And I feel the same way about Demario Douglas. It's like I'm going to die on this hill. But he did get a lot of targets with Drake May. Drake May seems to like to throw to him. Hopefully they can start connecting. And this week could be tough against the Bears, but they have a favorable schedule after that. And that brings us to Hunter Henry, who's one of the tight ends we want to talk about today. So let's bring up the list of tight ends to add. Mike Gesicki. Earlier we said don't be afraid to start him. Well, I said in a flex. Dave rightly pointed out if you're going to start 2 tight ends, make sure Gesicki is in the tight end spot, not the flex spot, because he plays on Thursday. If T. Higgins gets in a limited practice session today, Jamie, how would that affect your tight end waiver wire rankings?
It's got to be full, to sway me off of Gesicki because, look, they just lost Eric All also, and there was a stretch when Higgins came back in Week 3 where Eric All was getting more targets than Gesicki. So there's going to be a lot of moving parts here for the Bengals. We know Joe Burrow's playing at just a tier below the MVP quarterbacks, of Lamar and Goff and Jayden Daniels. He's having a very solid season. So Gesicki will still have some moments. But, yes, if you are concerned, you just pivot to Hunter Henry. But you just look at the roster percentages. It's not easy to find Henry by comparison to Gesicki. It's not easy to find him by comparison to Taysom Hill. So if you're talking about Gesicki versus Jonnu Smith and Jatavian Sanders and Theo Johnson and some of these other tight ends, I would just take my chances with Gesicki and then pivot to one of those other guys who you still might be able to find. So hopefully it's, if you're looking for Gesicki, Higgins misses one more week. And then you get the top-tier production that Gesicki has delivered 3 of the 4 times that Higgins has missed.
And for whatever reason, if you're looking for a starting fantasy tight end rest of season, I'd go to Henry before Gesicki because I do agree once T. Higgins comes back, I think the volume goes down for Mike Gesicki. He won't be quite as good for fantasy managers. Whereas Hunter Henry, at least 12 PPR points in each of 3 games that Drake May has started and finished with Henry. That's a good floor for any tight end. And now you're getting that for Hunter Henry in New England. And that's a team that's going to be playing from behind or in a competitive game most weeks. And that means lots of targets for Hunter Henry.
And I love his schedule. The Bears, the last 3 games, the Bears gave up 102 yards to Evan Ingram, 77 yards to Zach Ertz, 35 yards, and a rushing touchdown to Trey McBride. But in the most inexplicable quarterback decision, the guy was wide open in the end zone. Unbelievable. So he could have had a 2-touchdown game. And one obviously was the rushing touchdown. But they are struggling against tight ends. And you do often see teams that are great against receivers struggle against tight ends. Then after that, they have the Rams, who are 26th. They have the Dolphins, who are 9th. And they have the Colts, who are 30th. So it's a good upcoming schedule for Hunter Henry. And we also like Taysom Hill, Jamie. We like the opportunity. What do you think the chances of Taysom Hill? I think his career high in targets is 8. I believe he had 5 or 6 last week. What do you think the chances of Hill getting to 6 targets this week and also having a few carries in there?
It's pretty favorable. 5 targets last week, like you referenced, 4 catches. Olave most likely is not going to play. You have a receiving core that could be led by Cedric Wilson. It's a Falcons defense that hasn't exactly stopped a lot of things and has struggled at times with tight ends. But really, it's also what he's going to do on the ground. And the last time that he faced this Falcons team, he had 2 rushing touchdowns in that matchup. So you have Jamal Williams, who's dealing with a groin injury. Kendre Miller is on IR with a hamstring injury. So the backup running backs behind Kamara aren't there. And they may just say, okay, we need Kamara in more of a passing down situation because of how bad the receiving core is. So maybe we give Taysom Hill a few more carries. So there's a lot to like about the situation. 16 PPR points last week, 14 PPR points again in that first matchup against Atlanta. So you see I have him as a top 10 tight end for this week.
All right, real quick. Who has more catches in week 10, Jalen Waddle or Taysom Hill?
Oh, God.
Taysom Hill.
Yeah, Taysom Hill.
Oh, man, that's so bad. But really, I don't even care about your answer. I was just getting everybody psyched up for who has more. We're going to tell you how popular who has more is, and we're going to play the game when we come back on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. It is time for America's 18th favorite fantasy football game show. It is time for Who Has More. Here's how the game works.
Can you give me, just for reference, what's number 12?
Who Has Less? Very popular show, but we're getting there. We're close. I think people are starting to be more of a glass half full kind of fantasy manager and get into the who has more.
Okay.
But here's how the game works in case you're new. Okay, so I have a list of questions. I read them out loud. Dave and Jamie think about the questions. When they're ready to answer, they speak. If at any point during the game they have questions about the rules, I am happy to clarify. But let's give this a shot.
Is there a clock on the game?
Not really. You should have a nice internal clock. Let's not get too specific on the rules.
We could ruin this bit and just not answer any of them.
That would be bad TV.
Probably.
Didn't you hear the rule? The rule is they speak.
But you said there's no clock on it. So we could just sit here and have a conversation about other players to add off the waiver wire.
Major League Baseball from 2020. No clock.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we're just going to throw to first the entire time. All right, who has more carries?
The Yankees would drop it.
Oh, God. All right, you know what? Jamie's disqualified. Dave, who has more carries inside the 5-yard line? Lamar Jackson or Aaron Jones?
I will say Aaron Jones has more carries inside the 5.
Aaron Jones.
Not only is it Aaron Jones, it is Aaron Jones by a count of 7-0. Lamar Jackson is the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. He is averaging 29.5 points per game, and he has not had a single carry inside the 5-yard line.
If you want, you can go back and look up what he did rushing last week against the Raiders, or not against the Raiders. Last week, he did a ton passing the football against Denver. Didn't really run very much in that game against the Broncos. He's throwing the ball maybe a little bit better than he even did last year. Another MVP campaign for him. And he's never really been, or not recently in his career, a quarterback that runs inside the 5 very much. He doesn't swipe a lot of those short yardage touchdowns, and he doesn't have to. They've got Derrick Henry.
This is low. This is crazy. And on the other side of it, Aaron Jones has 7. If you go from the 5-yard line and not just inside the 5, he has 8 carries. He has scored, I think, on 1 of them. And 4 times after being stuffed, it has led to a Sam Darnold touchdown pass. All right, who has more carries inside the 5-yard line?
Ooh.
Kyler Murray or Zamir White?
I mean, I would take Kyler just because he's played more games. I would figure that he'd have more than Zamir White.
Agreed.
I mean, that's obviously the way you should go. No, you're wrong. It's Zamir White. 2-0. Kyler Murray is another quarterback.
Okay.
Kyler Murray is just not doing the things that lead to fantasy production, namely throw the ball and rush for touchdowns.
Well, but when he does rush for touchdowns, it's like from 40 yards out, and it gives him like a 28-point fantasy game. And that's kind of what you have to root for from Kyler Murray now, because he's not somebody that you can lock in with 2 passing touchdowns week in and week out.
It is 1-1 right now. You guys on the first one.
Are we playing against you?
No, playing against each other. You both got the first one right, and you got the second one wrong.
You said it was 1-1.
Well, you both got the first one right.
We're
both
tied.
Who has more ways to ruin a game show?
What? Wait, how am I wrong about this? It's 1-1.
Just go ahead. Keep on. Keep on
All
going.
right, who has more receiving yards in the last 3 games? Not weeks, but games. Cedric Tillman or Jackson Smith and Jigba?
Tillman.
I'll say JSN.
Dave with the point. 2-1. See how it works? JSN 3 more receiving yards than Cedric Tillman. Who would you rather have rest of season?
Oh boy. Both on a bye this week?
Yeah, I'd say JSN.
I'll take Tillman. Unless you tell me Metcalf's going to miss time.
No. He's expected to come back after the bye.
So I'll take Tillman.
They're out. Tillman? Okay. Number 4 here. Who has more PPR fantasy points in their last 3 games? George Pickens or Najee Harris?
Najee.
I think it's Najee.
Very good. Very good. It is Najee, actually, by quite a bit. He's averaging 3.5 more fantasy points per game than George Pickens in the last 3 games. Do you think anybody wants Najee Harris in terms of a sell high, or do you think he's just, going to be pretty good going forward? What do you think?
I mean, you could try and sell him high. We don't see typically a lot of, consecutive 100-yard games from him. He's had that in each of his last 2 outings. This is a team that I think is going to continue to evolve as they just added Mike Williams and Russell Wilson gets more comfortable. So maybe Jalen Warren takes on a bigger role in the passing game. But look, when you have a running back that's getting as much work as he has and actually producing, so can I turn Najee Harris into CeeDee Lamb? That's the type of trade I would obviously like to make. But you got to be giving up something significant in return to get Najee Harris. You got to be getting something significant in return to trade Najee Harris, because just what he's been accomplishing so far, it's been a pleasant surprise.
Only thing I can think of is you're loaded at running back. Najee is someone that you're just never going to start. You've got J.K. Dobbins, you've got Chuba Hubbard, et cetera, et cetera. You're just loaded, and you're going to trade Najee for kind of whatever you can get. Maybe you pair him with a receiver for an upgrade at wide receiver. In that instance, you don't have to ask for a lot for Najee. But there's someone who's desperate for running backs in every fantasy league, and I would imagine that they would pay a pretty penny for Najee right now. And this Steelers offense has looked really good since Russell Wilson's gone under center, and that includes the run game. Just everything seems to tie together nicely with Russ.
Who has more PPR fantasy points per game for the entire season? Fantasy points per game season long. Who has more, Breece Hall or Chuba Hubbard?
I'll say Chuba.
I'll say Chuba too.
You are both wrong. So we still have
Really?
Dave. It is Breece Hall, but just barely. 15.8 to 15.5. But you guys did call him a buy low. Dave, you brought it up. I think, Jamie, you agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Just to throw it out, in his last 2 games, he has 7 targets. And obviously, those are Devontae Adams games. Now, the first game with Adams, he had 9 targets. But the last 2 games, 7 targets combined. He's also one of the worst in the NFL in terms of zero or negative yardage carries. And I am not 100% convinced that he is the goal line back. We have seen a little bit of Braylon Allen in short yardage. I don't think they've really had goal line carries lately. But
They
I don't
did in
think
the Patriots game 2 weeks ago.
They did or they did not.
They did, and Allen scored.
Mm-hmm.
Allen scored, right. And then I think Allen was in on like a 4th and 1 in the last game. So I don't think it's just Allen's job. But when we say buy low on Breece Hall, is he a top 10 running back rest of season?
I don't think you have to value him that way. I think you can value him as a little bit lower than that, and he might be able to have some weeks where he's a top 5 fantasy running back, but probably most weeks he'll be right around RB15.
All right, let's hurry up here and finish up this fun segment because the next one's this is my favorite one. It's close. Who has more touchdowns, Derrick Henry or the Miami Dolphins?
Derrick Henry.
I'm going to say Henry.
It is Derrick Henry, 13-12.
Unbelievable.
The Dolphins, I believe, are the lowest scoring team in football. That is hard to fathom.
Well, they went into week 9. I think it was week 9. To a return week 8. They went into week 8 having scored 70 points through the first 7 weeks of the season, and they had scored 70 points against the Broncos in week 3 last year.
And Derrick Henry has 2 receiving touchdowns. He has 11 rushing, 2 receiving. All right, who has more?
He's already over 1,000 rushing yards on the year.
Who has more broken tackles, Chase Brown or Kyren Williams?
I don't think Kyren is that good in that category.
I'll say Chase Brown.
I'm going to say Chase Brown.
You guys are going to have to disagree. Jamie, you're going to have to start disagreeing. Let Dave answer first on the next one because you're both right on this. Chase Brown, 10-6. And we go to our last one with Dave holding a 1-point lead. This one is worth 2 points because I said so. Who has more strings, a banjo or a mandolin? And Dave, you have to answer first.
As you know, I'm an expert in this field. I will say the mandolin.
I will
Jamie?
say the Mandalorian.
No, yeah. Jamie's guessing banjo. Jamie, you're so wrong. It is obviously the mandolin. The mandolin has 8 strings. And a banjo, I believe, would have no more than 6 strings. Some of them, I think, have 5. Doesn't really matter. They don't have 8. Congratulations, Dave Richard. You are today's winner. One of our best episodes ever. We'll surely be climbing the rankings going forward. And who has more? Way to go, Dave.
See, I told you this game show is amazing. Awesome game. Well done, Adam.
And you guys didn't even need the clock. I'm very proud of you. All right, we'll be back with your questions, who to add, who to drop, up next on Fantasy Football Today. Back here on Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM, the sportsbook born in Vegas. We have some time for your tweets here, your ad drop questions. Is Xavier Worthy droppable?
I would say so. I don't know when you'll feel comfortable starting him as anything more than a low-end boom-bust flex.
He is droppable.
Okay, next tweet is from Joe. Would you drop Kraft or Laporta for Gesicki?
Kraft, yes. Laporta, yes. If you need a tight end for this week, if you don't want to take the chance that Gesicki doesn't have long-term value, I would drop Kraft and keep Laporta and try and carry both.
Agreed.
From Patrick, for people who have already clinched, who are early waiver wire stashes for weeks 13 and 14?
So I wouldn't start thinking about the matchups for weeks 13 and 14, but if you're already clinched, that's when you want to playoff-proof your roster. If you've got Kyren Williams and you don't have Blake Corum, you're asking for it. And if you do have a combo like that, a handcuff situation like that, and you still have a free roster spot, then go after one of those other lottery ticket type of running backs, everyone from Trey Benson on down. Even Isaac Guerrero would qualify.
Okay, next up we have Jason. Need to drop someone for a kicker. All right, take a look at you can guys go ahead and I'm not going to read all those names.
Deontay Johnson.
I think Johnson's the one who would probably get the least amount of attention on the waiver wire if you drop them.
And do we have one more or is that our last one? One more. Here it is. Would you drop Christian Watson for Quentin Johnston?
I would.
Okay.
Especially during his bye.
Is anybody picking up Khalil Herbert, by the way?
He's in the same situation of some of these other handcuffs. So if you need him, yes, but not a priority.
Fresh-legged lottery ticket.
All right. Well, if you need more help, check out our podcast, Fantasy Football Today, anywhere you listen to podcasts. We got another episode on CBS Sports Network tomorrow at 1 p.m. For Dave Richard and Jamie Eisberg, I'm Adam Azer. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for watching.